Okay, let's get into this today. We are looking at a case that is just incredibly intense and polarizing. We're talking about Darlie Routier. It's a capital murder conviction out of Texas that really since 1996 it's never really left the public conversation.
No, it hasn't.
And at the heart of this story is something just devastating. The loss of two very young boys, 6-year-old Devin and 5-year-old Damon Routier.
And it is so important that we approach this whole subject with the seriousness it deserves. I mean, we're talking about the loss of 2 children.
Absolutely.
So our goal here is to really conduct a thorough analysis of the source material. We're going to stick to the established facts, the evidence, which is often very contradictory, that was presented at trial, and the legal questions that they continue to hang over this case even decades later.
And we have to state the core conflict right up front because it's why this case is still so debated. Darlie Routier was convicted. She was sentenced to death for Damon's murder, and she was also charged for Devin's, though never tried for it. No. And this was all based on the prosecution's argument that she staged the whole crime scene, that she inflicted her own injuries, and that she was the one who murdered her sons.
Exactly. And on the other side, Routier herself has, from day one, consistently maintained that an unknown intruder, a violent one, broke into their home and attacked her and her sons.
So the state had to convince a jury that her story was impossible.
And they did. They successfully argued that the evidence both inside and outside the house showed that this intruder story just couldn't be true.
So we need to go back, right back to the very beginning, minute by minute, to really understand how 2 completely different versions of one night could come from the same set of facts. The timeline of that night in Rowlett, Texas, is terrifyingly specific. It all starts in the early morning of June 6, 1996. The Routier home, 5801 Eagle Drive. At exactly 2:31 a.m., a 911 call comes in.
And those first few moments of that 911 call are just crucial because they immediately establish this intruder narrative in the minds of the dispatchers and then, of course, the responding officers.
What did she say on the call?
She told the operator, with a lot of urgency, that her home had been broken into. She said an intruder had stabbed her children and that he'd cut her own throat.
So you have a report of a home invasion, an armed assailant who might still be there. The police response, it was incredibly fast.
Oh, yeah. Officers were there within 3 minutes of the call.
And you have to understand the sequence here. The protocol dictates that the site has to be secured first.
Right. Safety first.
So only after they did an initial sweep, checked the house, the grounds, and confirmed no intruder was present. Only then were paramedics allowed to come inside and actually attend to Darlie and her sons.
And tragically, that initial assessment, it revealed just how fatal the attack was. Both Devin and Damon had injuries from what they later determined was a large kitchen knife. They were fatal.
Darlie herself.
Darlie had knife wounds to her throat and her arm. She survived and was actually released from the hospital just 2 days later.
There's also this added layer to the whole tragedy, which is that her youngest child, a 7-month-old baby named Drake, was asleep upstairs.
Right, with his father, Darren Routier, and both of them were completely unharmed through this whole incident.
And that fact, the unharmed baby and husband upstairs, that would become a huge point of contention for both sides later on.
A huge point.
Okay, so let's turn to the detailed story that Darlie gave about this intruder, because this is the account that almost immediately started to unravel in the minds of the investigators.
Her story was very specific. She claimed she'd fallen asleep on the couch watching TV with the boys. She said she woke up and there was an unknown man standing inside the house. As she approached him, she claimed he fled.
And the weapon?
The weapon, she said, was dropped in the utility room as he ran. She said she picked it up, chased him away, and only then did she realize how horrific the wounds were to herself and her children.
So from the perspective of the first officers on the scene, there was some evidence, at least on the surface, that supported a break-in.
Yes, there was. They found a window screen in the garage that had been cut with a knife. That definitely suggested a possible entry point for an intruder.
But this is where the inconsistencies start to really drive the case.
It is. The primary point of suspicion for the investigators, it came from the timing of her story.
The timing.
They found it highly suspicious that Darlie claimed she only woke up after this incredibly severe attack had already fatally wounded both her sons and injured her.
Right. The sheer violence, the noise that must have happened.
Exactly. I mean, multiple deep stab wounds. You would logically expect any sleeping adult to wake up immediately. If the attack was as savage and prolonged as those injuries suggested, why was her first memory only of seeing the man run away?
That lack of reaction during the assault.
That was the red flag. That's what immediately shifted the focus of the investigation right onto Darlie.
And that initial suspicion, it only got deeper as they started to scrutinize the physical evidence. Or, maybe more accurately, the lack of evidence.
That's a critical distinction. Evidence of absence.
So she claimed the attacker escaped through the garage.
Right. But investigators stated, unequivocally, that there were no blood drops in the garage. None.
If an attacker is fleeing, carrying blood from two victims, you'd expect something?
You would expect trace evidence. And there was nothing. No disturbed items, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had run through that garage at all.
And then there's the entry point itself, the cut screen. Even that seemed undisturbed.
This is where the tiny forensic details become so important. The windowsills in the garage, including the one where the screen was cut, had these untouched layers of dust.
Meaning?
It implies that while the screen was definitely cut, and the defense hangs on that fact, no one had actually climbed through it. If a person goes through a tight window, they're going to wipe away dust, especially on that inner ledge.
So the prosecution's theory was what?
They argued Darlie cut the screen herself as part of the staging, but that no one actually used it to get in or out.
And the scene outside the house seemed to back that up.
Absolutely. The mulch in the flower beds right between the garage and the backyard gate was completely undisturbed.
If someone is fleeing in the middle of the night,
You'd see signs, footprints, crushed mulch, something. And it just wasn't there. The investigators took all of this together, the clean garage, the dusty windowsill, the untouched mulch, and they drew a conclusion.
that the crime scene was self-contained.
That the perpetrator never left the home.
And this sets up that profound conflict right there. You have a cut screen that suggests entry versus untouched dust and mulch that suggests no one passed through.
And the prosecution went with one, and the defense clung to the other.
This discussion of physical evidence, it leads us right to one of the most disputed items in the entire case, an item the defense would later say was definitive proof of the intruder.
We have to talk about the bloody sock.
This sock became like a character in the trial itself. Where was it found, and why did it matter so much?
Okay, so the sock was discovered 75 yards away from the Routier house.
75 yards. Let's put that in perspective.
It's about 3/4 of the length of a football field away from the back of the property. A really significant distance from the immediate crime scene inside.
And they tested it forensically.
They did. Lab results confirmed it had blood on it from both Devin and Damon, both of the slain boys.
And the sock itself. It didn't belong to Darlie or the children.
No. It matched other athletic socks that were found inside the house, and it was specifically identified as belonging to her husband, Darren.
So, on one hand, you have a sock, it's covered in the victim's blood, and it's found far from the house. That seems like powerful evidence that someone, an intruder, fled the scene and dropped it.
That was the defense's central claim. They argued the distance, the blood from both boys, it proved the crime wasn't contained inside the house. For them, it was the smoking gun for the intruder theory.
But the prosecution had their staging theory. How did they explain the sock being so far away?
They argued it was a staged ruse. They said, look, the mulch is undisturbed, the garage is clean. They claimed Darlie planted the sock out there to create a false trail to suggest an intruder's flight path.
So they used the lack of a trail to argue the sock was planted.
Exactly. Their point was, if an intruder ran that path, they would have disturbed the mulch, maybe left their own DNA, which they didn't. Therefore, the sock had to have been placed there deliberately.
That makes the sock such a fascinating piece of evidence because it supports two completely opposite theories depending on which surrounding facts you choose to believe.
It really is a fulcrum for the whole case. Do you believe the evidence of presence, the bloody sock 75 yards away, or the evidence of absence, the lack of a blood trail leading to it? The jury had to decide which story made more sense.
Let's shift to the evidence on Darlie herself, her injuries. Now, she was treated and released just 2 days later, and some reports described her wounds as superficial. But the details are much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, that word superficial became a weapon for the prosecution. It implied the wounds were easily self-inflicted.
But the medical records told a different story.
A more complex one, definitely. While the wounds weren't, life-threatening enough to keep her in the hospital for a long time, the knife wound to her neck. It was stated to have come within 2 millimeters of her carotid artery.
2 millimeters, that's an incredibly small margin.
It is a tiny shift in pressure or angle, and she could have bled out very, very quickly.
So that creates this ambiguity. Was it a near-fatal attack by an intruder, or was it an almost impossibly precise attempt at staging a wound without actually killing yourself?
Precisely. And that ambiguity became a major point of conflict between her initial doctors and the defense experts later on.
But before we get deeper into the trial itself, we have to talk about the most damaging piece of evidence against Routier that wasn't forensic at all.
The silly string.
The infamous silly string controversy. I mean, this video clip arguably had a bigger impact on the jury and the public than any blood spatter analysis.
This is where the case shifted. It went from a forensic investigation to a national media spectacle about character. So 8 days after the murders, newscasts showed Darlie and her family holding a birthday party at the boy's grave.
It was for Devon's upcoming 7th birthday, a posthumous celebration.
Right, but the specific footage that just exploded, it showed Routier smiling, laughing as she sprayed silly string on the graves while singing Happy Birthday.
And the impact of that visual was immediate and just devastating for her.
In our culture, especially after a crime this brutal, there's a very rigid expectation for how a grieving mother is supposed to act. Solemn, tearful, withdrawn.
And this wasn't that.
Not at all. And that brief 8-second clip was interpreted by so many people, and crucially by the prosecution, as bizarre, inappropriate, and just, lacking any genuine grief. It became instant proof that she was cold enough to kill her own kids.
Routier did try to explain it later. She offered her own emotional logic behind it.
She did. She said she was just trying to honor Devon and give him all the birthday wishes he'd never get. She said, but how do you know what you're going to do when you lose 2 children? How do you know how you're going to act?
It sounds like she was describing a very personal, maybe even dysfunctional way of handling an unimaginable level of grief.
Absolutely. But any attempt at context was just lost in the public outcry.
And the prosecution used that clip.
Oh, they used it skillfully. They painted this picture of a woman who lacked maternal feeling, who was just performing instead of genuinely mourning.
And there was more context that didn't make the news.
Right. Family members later pointed out that the newscast didn't show an earlier part of the day, a video that depicted a much more solemn ceremony for the boys. They suggested the broadcast was selectively edited to maximize the perception of her being inappropriate.
But the damage was done.
Completely. 4 days after that video aired, on June 18th, Darlie Routier was arrested and charged with capital murder. The silly string clip really served as the emotional foundation for the trial that came next. It provided the why, this character motive, before the prosecution even laid out the forensic how.
And that's a perfect way to put it. The trial started on January 6, 1997, and the prosecution's strategy was crystal clear. Solidify the narrative of motive and staging, and use the emotional weight of that silly string video to dehumanize her in the jury's eyes.
They really hammered home a specific characterization of her.
They did. The prosecutor, Toby Shook, he described Routier as, and I'm quoting here, a self-centered woman, a materialistic woman, and a woman cold enough, in fact, to murder her own 2 children.
I mean, that portrayal gave the jury the emotional framework they needed to even consider the claim that a mother could do this.
And the practical motive, the cold, hard reason for the crime, was supposedly financial.
Right. The state argued that the family was in deep financial trouble, significant debt, and that provided the motive. They pointed specifically to life insurance policies on the boys.
And to support the actual execution of the crime, they brought in 2 major forensic experts.
Yes. First, a crime scene consultant named James Cron. He testified that the evidence inside the house suggested the whole scene had been meticulously staged.
And the second, and maybe the most crucial forensic testimony for the prosecution, came from the blood spatter expert, Tom Bevel. For listeners who might not be forensic experts, can you explain what Bevel meant by cast-off blood? What did that imply about Darlie's movements?
Yeah, that's a great point. Cast-off blood refers to the droplets of blood that are flung from a weapon like a knife as the attacker raises it or pulls it back after a blow.
And the pattern can tell you something.
A lot, actually. The pattern and direction of those drops can indicate how many blows were struck and the direction of the arm movement.
And what did Bevel say he found?
He testified that he found patterns of cast-off blood on the back of Darlie's nightshirt. And his interpretation was that this pattern showed she had raised the knife over her head, specifically over her shoulder, as she pulled it out from each boy to stab them again.
Wow. That's devastating testimony.
It was, because it directly placed the nightshirt and therefore Darlie right in the middle of the attack, actively swinging the weapon. It just completely destroyed her claim that she was a victim who only woke up after it was over.
So the prosecution wove it all together. The emotional argument of her being a cold character, the motive of financial stress, and the forensic evidence of staged cast-off blood.
And it was a persuasive narrative. The jury saw the silly string video, they heard this compelling forensic argument, and on February 1st, 1997, they found her guilty of murdering Damon.
And just 3 days later, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. But the defense, they mounted a strong counter-argument. They focused on the lack of certainty and the huge flaws in the motive.
They rightly attacked that financial motive as being weak. Illogical, even.
The life insurance policies.
Exactly. The state claimed they were the trigger, but the defense pointed out that the insurance on the boys was only $10,000. Total.
$10,000.
It's a minimal amount. It wasn't even enough to cover the funeral expenses, let alone solve the family's debt problems. It didn't make sense as a reason to murder 2 children.
And the defense didn't just stop there. They used the family dynamic to poke holes in the whole narrative.
They raised 2 extremely important questions that really hit the core of the state's theory. First, if she murdered for money, why didn't she kill her husband, Darren?
Who had a much bigger policy.
A vastly larger policy, $800,000. He would have been the logical target for a financially motivated killer.
And the second question.
Even more poignant, perhaps. If she killed her 2 older sons to preserve her lifestyle, why did she leave her 7-month-old son, Drake, completely unharmed upstairs? The defense argued that a woman cold enough to kill 2 of her children for money wouldn't suddenly just spare the third.
Those are pretty big logical gaps in the state's story.
They are. The defense basically asserted that the case lacked all the things you usually need for a murder conviction, a compelling motive, a confession, or any witnesses.
But the defense had its own problems, especially when Darlie herself took the stand.
That decision was disastrous. She did it against her lawyer's advice, and reports say she just withered under cross-examination.
In a case like this, with so much circumstantial evidence, the jury is looking right at the defendant.
They are. They're watching your composure, your perceived honesty, and that intense cross-examination coming after the negative perception from the silly string video, it likely sealed her fate, no matter what the forensic arguments were.
On top of the motive and staging conflicts, there was also a direct contradiction in the medical evidence about Darlie's own wounds.
This is a textbook example of forensic conflict.
Right.
The first doctors who treated her, hours after the attack, had told police that her wounds might have been self-inflicted.
And the prosecution seized on that.
Immediately, they used it to support their staging theory.
But the defense brought in a very respected counter-expert.
They did. They called Dr. Vincent DeMaio, the chief medical examiner from San Antonio. And DeMaio testified specifically about that neck wound, the one that was 2 millimeters from her carotid artery.
What was his conclusion?
He stated that the wound was not consistent with the self-inflicted wounds he'd seen in his career. He talked about hesitation marks, these shallow, tentative cuts you often see in self-inflicted wounds. He said the severity and the singular nature of Darlie's deep wound suggested it was delivered by someone else.
So you have an initial assumption from the treating doctors versus a detailed forensic opinion from a top medical examiner.
Exactly. And that uncertainty, it was a critical flaw in the prosecution's whole staging argument.
It seems like the defense was trying to sell the jury on physical impossibility, while the prosecution was selling a psychological motive.
And that leads us to the most powerful argument the defense made about physical impossibility: the timeline.
Right. If the silly string provided the emotional reason for conviction, the timeline dispute gave the defense its strongest scientific argument for why Darlie Routier could not have done it.
We have to break down the numbers here because they are the mathematical heart of the defense's case.
It all hinges on the medical examiner's testimony about Damon's survival time.
Correct. The medical examiner testified that Damon could have only survived for approximately 8 minutes after he received his fatal injuries. That established a very critical and very tight window of time.
And now we have to layer in the 911 call.
Routier was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher for almost 6 minutes.
Okay, so if Damon was stabbed right before or at the start of that call, and he only lives for 8 minutes, that leaves a tiny window of just 2 minutes.
Exactly. 2 minutes for Darlie to perform a whole series of complex criminal actions.
And this is the defense's impossibility argument. What did they say she couldn't have done in that 2-minute window?
They contended it was physically insufficient. I mean, think about the sequence. She would have had to commit the acts, clean the knife, cut herself deeply enough to almost hit her carotid artery, stage the crime scene inside, and then The most time-consuming part runs 75 yards outside to plant the bloody sock.
And then get back inside before paramedics arrived.
Right, who got there 3 minutes after the call ended.
Running 75 yards, cutting yourself, staging a scene, all while under extreme distress in under 2 minutes. It does sound nearly impossible.
It's highly improbable, and the defense used this timeline brilliantly to try and inject reasonable doubt. They also connected it back to the lack of blood evidence we talked about earlier.
Remind us of that connection.
The defense noted that even though Darlie was bleeding significantly from her own injuries, her blood was not found in the garage or anywhere along that 75-yard path outside.
If she ran out there to plant the sock, you'd expect a drop of her blood somewhere.
You'd think so. The absence of her blood outside supports the intruder story for the sock, or at least supports the idea that Darlie never went outside at all.
So how did the prosecution dismantle this seemingly powerful mathematical argument?
Their rebuttal was clever. It was two-pronged. First, they questioned the sequence of events. They argued that Darlie could have planted the sock before she cut herself and called 911.
If the sock was planted earlier, the time constraint from the 911 call disappears.
Exactly. And their second point was to attack the precision of the science itself.
The 8-minute survival time.
They stressed that the medical examiner's 8 minutes was only an estimation. It wasn't a precise measurement from a stopwatch. Estimations in pathology can be conservative, and this legal wiggle room meant Darlie could have had more time than the defense claimed.
So by making the timeline fluid instead of fixed, they neutralized the defense's impossibility claim.
They did. The jury was left to decide whether to trust the estimation or the circumstantial evidence.
And beyond the timeline, there's another piece of evidence that has continued to evolve and get more complex over time. The fingerprint on the garage windowsill.
Right, at the suspected entry point. Initially, that fingerprint seemed to completely clear the family.
How so?
It was found on the windowsill where the screen was cut. In 2002, it was tested, and at that time, it was determined that it did not belong to Darlie, Darren, or either of the boys.
So for the defense, that was proof of an unknown intruder.
A critical piece of physical proof. But the interpretation of that print changed years later, thanks to a second expert, Pat Wertheim.
What did he say?
Years later, he testified before an appeals court. The issue was that the original print was smudged. It was incomplete. And while the 2002 analysis was conclusive at the time, Wertheim testified that he could not rule out Darlie Routier's right ring finger as the source of that print.
Wait, how does it go from definitively not being her to maybe being her?
It happens in forensics as technology and interpretation standards evolve. The 2002 test was likely comparing a low-quality print. Wertheim's later testimony suggested that given the smudging, there were enough shared characteristics with Darlie's finger that you couldn't eliminate her as easily as they thought in 2002.
So it didn't prove it was her?
No, it didn't prove her guilt, but it introduced ambiguity where the defense had previously claimed certainty. It took away a clear piece of exculpatory evidence.
Routier's conviction was swift, but the legal battle for her freedom has now gone on for decades, marked by all these legal challenges and appeals.
Defense attorneys filed appeals right away. They alleged numerous errors were made during the trial, things like issues with the official transcript, the performance of the trial lawyers, and critically, flaws in the initial crime scene investigation.
But the state courts didn't agree, at least not initially.
No, they didn't. An appeals court dismissed the claims, and a court ruling on her habeas corpus petition was also denied.
Let's quickly define that for our listeners. What is a habeas corpus petition in this context?
Sure. A writ of habeas corpus is a legal tool prisoners use to challenge the legality of their detention. So for Darlie, this was her way of arguing that her constitutional rights were violated during the trial, which would mean she'd need a new trial or to be released.
And the denial of that meant the conviction was legally upheld despite all the controversy.
Correct. And that brings us to the modern era of this case, which is defined entirely by the advancement of DNA technology.
The search for evidence that might have been invisible or untestable back in 1997.
Exactly. The modern legal fight is all about the fact that forensic tech has just moved so quickly since the late 90s. Since at least 2008, Routier has been granted the right to new DNA tests as the technology has improved.
And this has happened in multiple waves.
It has. In 2008, she was first granted the right to new DNA tests. Then, in January 2014, something really remarkable happened. A federal judge granted a request from both the prosecution and the defense for further, more advanced DNA tests.
The fact that both sides agreed to it is very unusual. It shows just how uncertain the original evidence really was. What items were they testing?
They focused on the three most critical items. First, the bloody fingerprint from the windowsill. Second, the bloody sock found 75 yards away. And third, her nightshirt with the controversial cast-off blood spatter. The hope was that modern testing could finally pull a foreign DNA profile from one of them.
And the cooperation continued. There was a third push for testing.
Yes. In 2018, the Criminal District Court ordered a third round of DNA testing, again with the backing of both sides.
It seems like the legal system itself wants clarity here.
It does. Modern DNA tech can do things like separate mixed DNA profiles, test tiny amounts of touch DNA, things that just weren't possible in 1997.
So after all these years, multiple rounds of testing, what is the current status of the case as of 2024?
And this is the key insight. The uncertainty persists. The results of these advanced DNA tests are still pending, or, if they've been completed, they haven't yielded a definitive, conclusive foreign profile that can be matched to a suspect.
So we're still in this scientific limbo.
We are. The modern science that could either confirm the conviction or shatter it remains elusive.
While the legal fight has been going on, the personal side of this has also evolved, specifically with her ex-husband, Darlie Routier.
Right. In June 2011, Darren filed for divorce. He said the decision was mutual, very difficult, and that they were doing it to end the limbo they'd been living in.
But crucially, he's maintained her innocence.
He has. Despite the divorce, Darlie Routier has consistently and publicly stated that he still believes his ex-wife is innocent. His ongoing belief, even after their marriage ended, just adds another layer of complexity to this case.
And the combination of the horrific crime, the inconclusive evidence, and the high-stakes appeals process has, of course, attracted enormous media coverage over the decades.
It's become a permanent fixture in true crime. There have been numerous books, like Precious Angels. The author of that book actually initially supported the conviction, but later reversed her position to support Darlie's fight for DNA testing.
And its presence on television speaks to the public's continued interest.
Oh, absolutely. It's been on Forensic Files, 48 Hours, Werner Herzog's powerful documentary series on death row. More recently, the ABC series The Last Defense dedicated a lot of time to examining potential flaws in the conviction.
The fact that it's still being covered so extensively shows just how much doubt still surrounds this case.
It really does. There is no consensus on whether justice was correctly served.
This analysis really highlights the challenge of reaching certainty in a case built almost entirely on conflicting interpretations of circumstantial evidence. On one side, you have the dramatic, irreconcilable conflicts in the physical scene, the undisturbed dust, the lack of blood in the garage, all arguing against a fleeing intruder.
And yet those facts directly clash with the existence of that bloody sock 75 yards away. And of course, the powerful timeline argument.
That 8-minute survival window for Damon versus the 6-minute 911 call.
The defense weaponized that, suggesting an almost impossible time frame for Darlie to have staged everything, hurt herself, and planted the evidence.
So the original conviction really relied on the jury accepting the state's rebuttal, that the timeline was just an estimation, that the wounds were self-inflicted, and that her character, as painted by the media, was cold enough to do it.
And the current status of the case, really it all rests on those pending DNA results. The promise of modern science potentially providing the one definitive piece of evidence that could finally end the debate.
The whole Routier case just illustrates the profound legal challenges of relying on circumstantial evidence when you have no confession and no definitive witness.
It does.
We spent a lot of time dissecting the physical evidence, the cast-off blood, the neck wound, the bloody sock, the dusty windowsill. But consider how much weight the jury ultimately placed on that brief, emotionally charged clip of Darlie Routier smiling and spraying silly string at her son's gravesite.
When we analyze a case that lacks definitive proof and hinges on how we interpret someone's actions under extreme duress, it brings up an important question for you to consider. How do we, as observers or potential jurors, separate our powerful emotional responses to someone's perceived behavior, their unusual way of grieving, from the objective and often ambiguous facts presented by forensic science? What role should our emotions play in the pursuit of truth?
That is a very powerful question to think about.
Thanks for listening.